So today, the United States Supreme Court issued a rare 9-0 unanimous decision. And what makes this ruling different from most cases you hear about is not just the outcome, but how deeply it reaches into everyday American life. This is not a technical ruling that only affects lawyers or judges. This decision directly impacts how government power is exercised, how individual rights are protected, and how future cases across the country will now be decided. And whether you realize it or not, this ruling affects you, regardless of what state you live in, who you voted for, or where you stand politically. Before we get into what the court decided, you need to understand why a unanimous decision like this is such a big deal. The Supreme Court hears thousands of cases every year, but only a small fraction result in full opinions. Of those, unanimous rulings are rare, especially in cases that deal with constitutional rights, government authority, or individual freedoms. When all 9 justices, spanning the entire ideological spectrum, agree on both the reasoning and the outcome, it sends a powerful signal to every lower court in the country. And that's exactly what happened here. This morning, the court released an opinion that immediately began reshaping legal strategy nationwide. Attorneys started revisiting active cases, judges began reviewing pending motions, government agencies began reassessing internal policies. What makes this decision even more significant is that it doesn't just answer one narrow legal question. Instead, it establishes a clear constitutional framework, one that replaces a patchwork of inconsistent interpretations that had been developing for years. To understand why this matters, you have to look at what the legal landscape looked like before today. For a long time, courts across the country have been divided on how certain constitutional protections should be applied in real-world situations. Depending on where you lived, your rights could be interpreted very differently. What was considered lawful government action in one state might be unconstitutional in another. That kind of inconsistency creates uncertainty, not only for citizens, but also for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges. The Supreme Court stepped in because that uncertainty had reached a breaking point. Lower courts were issuing conflicting rulings, appeals were piling up, and critical constitutional questions were being answered differently based on geography instead of principle. The justices made it clear that this situation was no longer acceptable. That principle alone explains why all 9 justices were able to agree. Now, here's where this decision becomes especially important. Rather than simply choosing between existing legal standards that lower courts were using, the Supreme Court introduced a new unified test, one that now applies nationwide. This new standard is designed to balance 2 competing concerns, protecting individual constitutional rights while still allowing the government to respond to legitimate public safety issues. The court explicitly rejected approaches that were either too permissive or too restrictive. Instead, they created a middle ground framework that requires objective justification, not speculation, assumptions, or vague concerns. And that shift matters more than most people realize. Under the old system, some government actions were justified using broad, loosely defined doctrines that gave officials wide discretion. In practice, that discretion sometimes expanded beyond its original intent, leading to inconsistent enforcement and legal uncertainty. The Supreme Court stepped in because that uncertainty had reached a breaking point. The court made it clear that constitutional protections cannot rest on open-ended theories. If the government is going to exercise extraordinary power, it must be able to clearly explain and justify that decision using objective, articulable facts. That requirement alone is going to change how cases are argued, how evidence is evaluated, and how courts review government conduct going forward. The justice who authored the majority opinion crafted language that resonated across ideological lines. The reasoning avoids political framing and instead focuses squarely on constitutional text, historical precedent, and practical consequences. That careful approach is one reason the opinion drew unanimous support. But don't mistake unanimity for simplicity. Even though all 9 justices agreed on the outcome, the opinion itself acknowledges that the new standard will raise difficult questions in future cases. The court intentionally avoided rigid definitions, recognizing that constitutional law must be applied to unpredictable real-world situations, and that choice sets the stage for what comes next. Because while today's decision resolves long-standing disagreements among courts, it also opens the door to new legal battles that will determine how this ruling is applied in practice. Already, attorneys across the country are preparing arguments based on this new framework. Cases that were once considered settled may now be challenged. Others that were previously dismissed could be reopened under the Clarified standard. This ruling doesn't just affect future cases, it has the potential to reshape ongoing litigation right now. And that's exactly why so many legal experts are calling this one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in recent years. But here's the part most headlines aren't talking about. Even though the court strengthened constitutional protections, it did not rule in favor of the individual who brought the case. In fact, the justices concluded that even under the new, stricter standard, the government's actions in this specific situation were still lawful. That outcome has sparked intense debate among scholars and civil liberties advocates. Some argue it shows the court struck the right balance. Others worry it leaves too much room for interpretation. And that tension is at the heart of why this decision matters so much. Because the real impact of this ruling won't be determined today. It will be determined over the next several years as courts apply this standard to real people, real homes, and real situations. Why they were failing and how the Supreme Court's new test changes everything moving forward. Before today's ruling, the United States was operating under a fragmented legal system when it came to this constitutional issue. Courts across the country were using different standards, often reaching opposite conclusions based on nearly identical facts. This inconsistency is one of the main reasons the Supreme Court stepped in. To understand how disruptive this decision really is, we need to look at the 3 legal standards that were battling each other before the court intervened. The first standard was probable cause. This is the highest legal threshold, and the one most Americans are familiar with. It's the same standard required for obtaining a search warrant. Under this approach, law enforcement needed strong evidence suggesting that a serious issue was occurring before taking action. About a dozen states relied on this standard in emergency-related cases. While it offered strong protection for individual rights, critics argued it was often too slow and too rigid. By the time officers gathered enough information to meet probable cause, the emergency might already be over, or worse, someone could be seriously harmed. The second standard was reasonable suspicion. This is a lower threshold that allows officers to act based on specific, articulable facts, suggesting something may be wrong. Roughly half the states used this standard, believing it struck a better balance between public safety and constitutional protections. But even reasonable suspicion came with problems. Courts struggled to define exactly what qualified, and rulings varied widely. What one judge saw as reasonable, another dismissed as speculation. The result was unpredictability for citizens and for law enforcement alike. Then there was the third standard, a broad doctrine that some courts allowed to justify government action even when neither probable cause nor reasonable suspicion existed. This approach became the most controversial of all because it allowed officials to act based on generalized concerns rather than concrete evidence. In practice, this meant the government sometimes exercised extraordinary power based on vague circumstances, intuition, or precautionary reasoning. Over time, critics warned that this doctrine had evolved far beyond its original purpose, effectively creating a loophole in constitutional protections. That loophole is what the Supreme Court shut down. Rather than choosing one of these three standards, the justices rejected them all and introduced an entirely new constitutional test, one designed to unify the law nationwide. Under this framework, government action without traditional authorization is only permitted if officials have an objectively reasonable basis to believe that someone is facing serious and imminent harm. Those words, serious and imminent, are not accidental. They are the backbone of the new rule. This standard is intentionally more demanding than vague suspicion, but more flexible than full probable cause. It requires specific facts, not assumptions. It also removes subjective judgment from the equation. The question is no longer what a particular officer believed, but what any reasonable official would conclude under the same circumstances. That shift is critical. By focusing on objectivity, the court made clear that constitutional rights cannot depend on personal intuition, departmental habits, or after-the-fact justifications. Government officials must be able to clearly explain why their actions were necessary at the time, not after something goes wrong. The court also outlined several factors that courts should consider when applying this standard. These include the credibility of reports received, the source of the information, what officials personally observed, and whether the circumstances genuinely suggested immediate danger. Importantly, the court emphasized that no single factor is enough on its own. Instead, courts must evaluate the totality of the circumstances. This prevents cherry-picking individual details to justify actions that, taken as a whole, may not meet constitutional requirements. However, the court deliberately avoided defining certain key terms too precisely. They did not provide a rigid definition of what qualifies as serious injury, nor did they specify how soon a threat must be to count as imminent. This was a conscious decision. The justices recognized that emergencies don't follow scripts, and rigid definitions could create dangerous loopholes in the opposite direction. Lawyers on both sides will now argue over what qualifies as serious harm, how imminent is imminent, and which facts matter most. Courts will be tasked with drawing those lines case by case, guided by the Supreme Court's framework. Now, here's where the decision takes an unexpected turn. Even though the Supreme Court rejected the legal reasoning used by the lower courts, it still ruled against the individual who brought the case. In other words, the court said the lower courts used the wrong legal test but still reached the correct outcome. That kind of ruling is rare, and it has major implications. The justices examined the facts of the case under the new standard and concluded that, given the totality of the circumstances, a reasonable official could have believed there was an imminent risk of serious harm. Based on that conclusion, the government's actions were deemed constitutional in this specific instance. This part of the ruling has drawn sharp criticism. Civil liberties advocates argue that the court missed an opportunity to send a stronger message about limits on government power. Others countered that the decision proves the new standard isn't merely theoretical, it has real teeth, but it doesn't ignore genuine safety concerns. What's especially notable is that there was no dissent. While some justices wrote separate concurring opinions expressing caution about how broadly the standard might be applied in the future, all 9 agreed on both the framework and the outcome. That unanimity sends a powerful message to lower courts. This is settled law. But settled law doesn't mean settled consequences. Across the country, there are hundreds of pending cases involving similar constitutional questions. Many of those cases were argued under standards that no longer exist. Attorneys are already filing motions asking courts to reconsider rulings under the Supreme Court's new framework. Some convictions may be overturned, others may be upheld, but nearly all will need to be reanalyzed. And that's only the beginning. Because beyond individual cases, this ruling will force government agencies to revise policies, retrain personnel, and rethink procedures that were built around now rejected doctrines. What was once routine may now be unconstitutional. which practices are most likely to change, and why this ruling could reshape the balance between privacy and public safety for years to come. Now let's talk about what this Supreme Court decision means for you today, not in theory, not in a law textbook, but in real life. The justices reinforced that the Constitution does not impose a duty on individuals to respond to inquiries, answer doors, or engage absent a legal requirement. Silence alone is not evidence of wrongdoing. Inactivity is not an emergency. That distinction matters more than ever under the new constitutional framework. If government officials appear at your home and you choose not to respond, that decision, by itself, does not give them legal authority to act. There must be additional, objective facts suggesting a real and immediate risk of serious harm. The court was explicit that generalized concern, vague reports, or speculative fears are not enough. Officials must be able to articulate why action was necessary based on observable and credible information, not assumptions or worst-case scenarios. For many Americans, this clarification offers meaningful reassurance. However, the court also made clear that constitutional rights are not absolute in emergency situations. When multiple factors are present, credible reports of danger, concerning observations, lack of response, and contextual history, those elements can combine to meet the objectively reasonable basis standard. This means the analysis is holistic, not mechanical. Across the country, welfare checks have become increasingly common. Sometimes they are requested by neighbors, sometimes by family members, sometimes by former partners or acquaintances. These checks often begin with genuine concern, but until now, the legal standards governing them were inconsistent. This decision significantly narrows when welfare checks can escalate into more intrusive government action. Officials can no longer rely on broad doctrines to justify entering private spaces. They must show that the situation genuinely suggested serious, imminent harm at the time, not merely the possibility of harm at some undefined point in the future. That change is likely to affect a wide range of practices. Legal analysts predict increased scrutiny of cases where officials relied on indirect reports, emotional impressions, or non-specific concerns. Courts will now ask tougher questions. Who made the report? What exactly was said? What did officials observe themselves? And did those facts truly justify immediate action? These questions are not academic. They will determine whether evidence is admissible, whether charges stand, and whether civil liability applies. Another area that will be heavily impacted involves laws that allow temporary restrictions on individual rights based on perceived danger. While the Supreme Court did not directly rule on these laws, its reasoning creates a higher bar for how they are enforced. That principle is going to reshape enforcement strategies nationwide. At the same time, advocates for public safety and victims' rights have raised concerns about the ruling's potential consequences. They worry that stricter standards could delay intervention in situations where help is needed, but evidence is hard to articulate. The court acknowledged this tension and did not dismiss it lightly. In fact, the justices repeatedly emphasized that their goal was balance, not paralysis. The standard they created is meant to allow action when necessary, but only when necessity can be objectively demonstrated. Whether that balance holds up in practice remains to be seen. Over the next year, courts will begin issuing rulings that apply this new framework. Patterns will emerge, lines will be drawn. Some applications will be upheld, others rejected. And with each decision, the contours of this standard will become clearer. It reasserts the idea that constitutional protections do not shrink simply because situations are inconvenient or uncertain. At the same time, it recognizes that government has a role in responding to genuine emergencies, so long as it can justify that response with clear, objective reasoning. That dual message is why this decision was unanimous. The Supreme Court wasn't trying to score ideological points. It wasn't signaling allegiance to any political movement. It was restoring coherence to constitutional law in an area that had become dangerously fragmented. And in doing so, the court sent a message that will echo through courtrooms, police departments, and government offices across the country. So, what should you take away from this decision? First, your rights inside your home remain among the strongest protections the Constitution provides. Second, government action in emergencies must now meet a clear nationwide standard. Third, this ruling will affect not just future cases, but ongoing ones and potentially past ones as well. And finally, the practical impact of this decision will unfold over time, shaped by how courts apply it in real world situations. This isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new chapter in constitutional law. And as those chapters are written, they will define how freedom, privacy, and public safety coexist in modern America. If you found this analysis helpful, make sure to stay informed, stay engaged, and pay attention to how this ruling is applied moving forward, because the consequences of today's decision are just beginning to unfold.